Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Kelly Fedoruk, and I'm an attorney with Alliance Defending Freedom. Alliance Defending Freedom is a national legal alliance, and we litigate cases around the country and internationally on issues relating to religious freedom, marriage and the family, and the sanctity of life. I've submitted my full statement in writing, and I ask that that be made a part of the record. Today I am pleased to be before this committee to speak on the legal impact that this bill, S-38, will have on Rhode Island citizens' religious freedom if it is enacted. Our country has a long-standing tradition of respect and tolerance for the viewpoints of all Americans. Yet this bill fails to protect religious freedom. Instead, it seeks to confine religious freedom to the four walls of a church or a place of worship. But the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of Rhode Island applies to everyone at all times. It protects the free exercise of religion, which means you don't leave your conscience at home when you go to work or you go out into the public. This bill fails to meet even those bare minimum requirements of the First Amendment, however. If enacted, it would give your constituents a choice that no one should ever have to face, to either violate your conscience or face legal persecution. We should not legislate prejudice and discrimination against people of faith in this state. This bill not only raises constitutional concerns, but the absence of full religious protections is curiously inequitable, considering that where same-sex unions are legal, same-sex couples are able to celebrate their unions and find individuals and businesses eager to assist them with their ceremonies. There is thus no need to discriminate against people of faith. Indeed, we have handled multiple cases where laws redefining marriage and expanding a sexual agenda have been used to persecute regular, everyday Americans who simply want to live their lives and run their businesses according to their conscience and their religious beliefs. And it's important to note that it's not a belief about homosexual behavior. It's a belief that marriage is between one man and one woman. I want to share with you just a couple examples where laws such as this one have been used to persecute people of faith because of a failure to extend the constitutionally required First Amendment protections. One example of this discrimination is Catholic Charities. In Massachusetts, Illinois, and the District of Columbia, they have been forced out of the adoption business because of their belief, because they want to ensure that children are placed with both a mom and a dad. And by forcing Catholic Charities' hand, the government harmed innocent children merely because it refused to practice tolerance of all positions. Further, as is the case here in Rhode Island, Massachusetts has adoption agencies that place children with same-sex couples, so it's not an issue of whether they're of access. What the failure to do is to extend religious freedom protections to all people and to practice tolerance of all viewpoints. That is not religious freedom, it's religious intolerance. Another example, we're currently representing a young woman in New Mexico, a photographer who was asked to photograph a same-sex commitment ceremony. This young woman declined the offer because of her strong religious beliefs about what marriage is. The same-sex couple went on to find a different photographer and had a successful commitment ceremony together. But a few months later, they came back and chose to legally persecute this young woman for simply trying to live out her life and her business according to her conscience. She was hauled before the New Mexico Human Rights Commission and was ultimately fined nearly $7,000 for the alleged discrimination. What happened to this young woman is not religious freedom. This is an example of discrimination toward people of faith that S-38 will allow if it is passed. I analyzed the bill before us today, and it fails to protect the religious freedom of Rhode Island citizens. It leaves unprotected judges who don't want to solemnize a union, charitable organizations, including Catholic hospitals, nursing homes, adoption agencies, as I already mentioned. It also leaves unprotected wedding venue owners, clerks, bakeries, photographers, the list goes on. There's so much more involved when you're looking at a marriage than just the mere act of solemnization. People of faith live all over the state, and we should not, again, be enacting legislation that fails to protect their religious freedom. So, in conclusion, respect and toleration of all viewpoints drove the very foundations of our country. The religious protections put forth in the proposed legislation are not only inadequate, but the extreme narrowness of those protections seems to suggest an intent to legislate prejudice toward the people of faith in this great state. The Sixth Circuit recently stated in its opinion, declaring that a university cannot compel a student to alter or violate her belief system. They said that tolerance is a two-way street. So members of the committee, Tonight, I ask that you protect the religious freedom of all Rhode Island citizens. Thank you so much for the opportunity to appear before you, and I stand ready to answer any questions that you might have.
Are there any questions or comments? Senator Lombardi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kelly, I'm just curious. We had a situation here in Rhode Island involving a school prayer and young lady receiving flowers, the plaintiff in that case receiving flowers, and it was a private florist who refused to deliver the flowers, and they brought an action against that florist. What's the theory behind finding these human rights violations to private entities, such as the photographer, such as the florist, and perhaps the justice of the peace who performs a civil ceremony but doesn't want to do it based on his religious beliefs?
Right. Well, the Supreme Court and federal courts as well have found that the same First Amendment that applies to an individual also applies to a business, to a corporation. 13 federal courts recently have just found that a business, a for-profit entity, cannot be compelled to violate its conscience. And the U.S. Supreme Court has upheld that as well. We're all, we all can practice our business and live out, you wouldn't expect, if you flip the situation around, take, for example, you have a gay bar, for example. You wouldn't want to force them to hire straight people if they didn't want to. You want to live out your business and according to your conscience and to your beliefs.
My question is more to that photographer that you said was brought before the Human Rights Commission in the particular state that you mentioned.
Right.
What was the theory brought behind a private photographer on a human rights violation?
Well, in New Mexico, they have the non-discrimination law there, and so they filed the claim under the non-discrimination, say she discriminated on the basis of sexual orientation. Interestingly enough, our client is happy to photograph gays and lesbians, but what she doesn't want to do is use her art form, her business, to affirm a message that is marriage that contradicts her deeply held belief. And the Supreme Court has stated, in Hurley, for example, that is her right under the Constitution.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Senator Hodgson, then Senator Archibald.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
Senator, can you turn your microphone on, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator. Just a couple questions about the examples that you've cited, and Catholic Charities of Boston is very frequently spoken about. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, the state of Massachusetts at no point canceled their contract. It was an affirmative step by Catholic Charities because they no longer wanted to participate. Is that fair to say?
Catholic Charities in all of these states were given a choice, like I said.
But in the case of Catholic Charities of Boston, when they ceased offering adoption services, it was an affirmative decision of the organization to withdraw from the process rather than the state stripping them of any licensure.
Well, the government refused to give them any exemption to allow them to continue to operate. I mean, instead of violating their conscience, these organizations and others like them, other faith-based charitable organizations, also oftentimes work through contracts or licensing by the state, and so they need to be protected.
So they're an agent of government, is what you're saying. In that capacity, they were acting as an agent of government. And the reason I mention this is that the head of the Catholic Charities of Boston at the time that they did withdraw from the adoption services has very publicly rebuked those who use that circumstance as an illustration of same-sex marriage leading to this result. I think it's a phenomenon that you'll find in common with both the New Mexico illustration that you used and Massachusetts. Existing anti-discrimination statutes are the vehicle that are used to give rise to these actions that you're afraid of. New Mexico, you talked about a commitment ceremony. There was no gay marriage in New Mexico, right? So that's a circumstance that arose independent of the question of same-sex marriage. The fear of individuals and organizations to be persecuted on their beliefs is certainly not trivial, and it certainly should be something that we air and discuss fully tonight, and frankly as a society going forward. But we're sort of using apples to oranges when we talk about a legal mechanism that is not marriage equality that we're looking at tonight.
Well, with all due respect, Senator, where laws in the states that are expanding sexual gender, be them non-discrimination laws, civil union, or same-sex marriage, they are being asked to affirm a message that they don't believe. And interestingly enough, in the cases where these non-discrimination laws are being used, they're not discriminating based on sexual orientation. They're being asked to host ceremonies, wedding ceremonies, commitment ceremonies, depending on the laws of that state. And that is to affirm a message that is mirrored, that directly contradicts their religious beliefs. So it doesn't really matter the vehicle. The point is that and the point is here, before the bill before us today fails to protect the religious freedom of these people. And so people here in the state of Rhode Island, photographers who are asked to, photograph a ceremony at the church down the street or whatever it might be, they are not protected. And that's the point, right?
But isn't that what's in place right now under the existing statutory schemes for discrimination? Aren't all of the things that you're concerned about, the florist in Cranston is subject to the liability you're very concerned about, and it's a valid discussion. Don't get me wrong, I'm not discounting it, but those threats to individual conscience exist already, and they're not going to be impacted one way or another by this bill.
With all due respect, Senator, then we should be
But they're not going to
absolutely
be
not
impacted by
supporting
this bill.
legislation that fails to protect the constitutionally required First Amendment freedoms. You shouldn't be supporting a bill that doesn't protect religious freedom, and this bill clearly doesn't protect it.
Thank you.
Senator Archibald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My comment's directed to Kelly, and then I have one for the father. Kelly, you've talked about the symptomatic problem with the implementation of S38 and that it's going to discriminate religiously. What do you propose for the remedy? You're bright, you're articulate, you've talked a lot about the issue as it affects the group you represent. I'd like to hear you present what you feel is the remedy if we want to have in concert civil unions with religious freedom.
You're asking what the remedy would be
What's the
for
remedy?
this bill?
Yes, so that the impact wouldn't be discriminatory upon a group of Catholics who don't want to photograph a same-sex couple.
I would say put into the bill comprehensive protections for religious freedom. I mean, the basic freedoms that the First Amendment prescribes.
How? Can you be more specific? What do you propose would do that? Any type of language? I'm not trying to ask you to write a treatise on the spot.
Right,
But
right.
you're bright enough to be able to tell me what the premises are behind what your argument is.
If you want to send to the clerk after the hearing or a date in the future,
Thank you, Mr.
what you
Chairman.
propose is language that you suggest, and also send a copy to Senator Archibald, that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah,
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Mr. Chairman. Let me direct my comments to the father for a minute.
The only thing I'm going to ask, Senator, is when a person speaks, you can ask them a question after that. We're not going to keep rotating back and forth among the different witnesses who are speaking.
Absolutely.
You can continue, Senator, just this one
Absolutely,
time.
Mr. Chairman. I promise
Thank
I'll
you.
be highly efficient on time this evening. Father, as a representative of the Catholic Church, do you believe that all men are created equal?
Yes.
And do you believe that as all men being created equal, they have the right to believe spiritually in any God that they believe in or
Yes.
choose not to believe in? Yes.
Yes.